The morning Brenda got stung on her forehead was the first time I smiled in a week. And not because I hate her, but because justice finally came in stripes and wings. It started 3 days earlier when I walked out to my little wooden honey stand by the road and noticed something off. The sign was tilted. A few scuff marks were smeared across the counter. And most telling of all, 6 of my freshly bottled jars were missing. No cash in the honor box, no note, and sticky footprints leading off my land like someone had just helped themselves to my bees' hard work. Now, I'm not a man who likes to jump to conclusions. I've seen enough fires in my life, literal and otherwise, to know they usually start with a spark and not a bang. But this wasn't some random kid or passing stranger. These weren't clumsy grab-and-go tracks. They were planned. I followed them all the way to the edge of my fence and beyond that, toward the HOA-controlled road that separates my ranch from the gated community. And that was when I saw her, Brenda, the queen of complaint, the monarch of meddling. She was parked half a block away, rearranging jars of my honey in her trunk like they were her prized possessions. She even had the audacity to peel off my handwritten labels and slap her own printed ones on. I stood there in disbelief, the morning sun beating down on my cap, the buzzing of bees behind me as they flitted between the lavender and the clover. I wanted to march over there and say something, but I didn't. Not because I was afraid, but because this wasn't a moment for shouting. This was a moment to observe. Because if Brenda thought she could steal from me and turn it into a business opportunity, then she was about to learn a hard truth. Later that afternoon, I checked my camera footage. Sure enough, there she was, white sun hat, oversized sunglasses, floral dress, and all, walking right up to the stand like she owned the place. She even sniffed one jar before taking it. Then she took another, and another. The whole thing was so casual, you'd think she was shopping at a boutique. What's worse is she looked straight into the lens once and smirked. That smirk was going to cost her. The next day, I went into town to pick up a few things and ran into a neighbor from the HOA side. He mentioned Brenda was now selling honey at the community clubhouse. Called it Brenda's Garden Gold. Said it tasted just like real wildflower honey. That's because it was mine. She was not only stealing it, she was profiting from it. I could feel the burn rise in my gut, but again, I stayed calm. I've been through worse. A house fire can gut a man's world in minutes. This was manageable. Bees, after all, don't get mad. They get organized. That evening, as the sun lowered and cast golden rays across the pasture, I went out to the hives. There are 15 in total, tucked behind the wild hedges that mark the border of my land. One of them, Hive 12, is home to the most defensive, hardworking bees I've ever raised. I call them the stingers. They're not aggressive by nature, but they don't like being disturbed, and they're keen on guarding their honey like it's liquid gold. I made some adjustments to their frames, added a few strategic scent cues near their flight path, and gave them a little extra sugar. Water to keep their energy up. What happens next, I thought, won't come from me. It'll come from the hive. But before that plan could unfold, Brenda made things worse. She had the nerve to march down to my driveway the following morning with a clipboard and a camera. Claimed my honey stand was attracting bears and bugs and was a hazard to the community. I told her politely but firmly that she was on private property and that her HOA rules stopped where my fence started. She laughed in my face, pointed at the bees flying overhead like they were illegal drones, and said, "They don't follow fences and neither do consequences." I didn't reply. I just nodded, took her picture, and went back inside. That afternoon, I rewatched the footage again and clipped the part where she took the jars, close up and all. I saved it to 3 USB drives and 1 cloud folder. Not because I planned to sue. No, Brenda wasn't worth the court fees. I had something better in mind. By that night, word had already spread through the grapevine that Brenda was planning a weekend brunch event at the HOA clubhouse lawn. Her new honey brand would be on full display. Samples, fancy labels, even a little speech about sustainable local sourcing. She invited the board, neighbors, realtors, and local press. It was going to be her grand launch, the day she became a local celebrity. What she didn't know was that the scent of stolen success would carry more than just attention. It would carry bees. I went to bed that night with a strange peace. Not vengeful, not smug, just settled, because I wasn't setting a trap. I was simply letting nature do what it does best when it's been wronged, respond. And that's why the next morning, when Brenda got stung clean between the eyebrows by one lone forager who must have caught a whiff of her stolen stash, I smiled. Because it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The hive had noticed. And the stingers never forget. The sting between Brenda's brows didn't slow her down. If anything, it made her double down with even more fury, like the welt on her face was some kind of war medal. The next day, she showed up at the HOA clubhouse meeting with a scarf dramatically draped over her head and oversized sunglasses covering half her face. She looked like a villain in hiding, but acted like a heroine under siege. With a deep, exasperated sigh and a printout in hand, she presented a fabricated incident report about a rogue bee attack. According to her story, she had been inspecting a nearby wildflower path when she was ambushed by an aggressive swarm that targeted her specifically. The board murmured with concern. She had pictures of her swollen face, a few dramatic pauses, and, as always, her signature ability to sound like she cared about the community more than herself. But her true aim became clear fast. She wanted the HOA to take action against what she now called the unauthorized agricultural activity happening adjacent to our boundaries. She demanded the honey stand be removed, that the bees be relocated, and that I be issued a warning. Never mind the fact that my property sat outside their jurisdiction. She waved her hands and said something about spillover influence and community perimeter standards. She might as well have been reading out of a thesaurus with a grudge. Someone on the board, a man named Cliff, who usually kept quiet and nodded through everything, finally asked if the bees were actually crossing onto HOA property or bothering residents. Brenda, desperate, blurted out that a child had been chased by them near the community pool. A few members gasped. But then, in a twist so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so malicious, a younger board member named Elsie pulled up footage from her Ring camera, which showed the alleged child was actually her own bulldog, Winston, wearing a Halloween bee costume from last year. Brenda had mistaken a dog for a child in danger. The room fell quiet. Brenda muttered something about unreliable memory due to swelling and trauma and tried to pivot to zoning concerns, but the damage was done. That lie would have sunk most people. But Brenda, she just changed tactics. Later that day, I found new notices pinned to my mailbox. One was from the HOA, and signed, of course, recommending I review residential perimeter activity for compliance and safety. The other was a printed-out flyer for Brenda's upcoming honey event, boldly titled, Brenda's Garden Gold, Sweetness You Can Trust. It included a photo of her holding a jar of my honey with her fake label slapped across it. I shook my head and chuckled. The nerve. But I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was just gathering. I spent the afternoon walking my property, checking on the hive. The bees were thriving, especially the stingers. Their activity had increased, likely due to the warmer weather and a late bloom of goldenrod. I adjusted a few frames and refilled the sugar water to keep them energized. Then I walked the edge of my property, just near the border to the HOA path. A few of my wildflowers had crept into the unmaintained easement. Nothing illegal, but enough for curious bees to wander over. That's when an idea started to take shape. Not revenge exactly, but a kind of rebalancing. I knew Brenda would try to steal again. People like her don't stop because someone tells them no. They stop when something stops them. So I prepared. I moved a few scent lures from the hives toward the far side of my property, near the wildflowers that bordered Brenda's street. Nothing that would cause harm, just enough to leave a trail. Then, Near the stand, I replaced the honey jars with lookalikes. Same glass, same lids, but filled with a sticky mix of molasses, habanero extract, and a dash of queen bee pheromone. Enough to keep human hands off after one taste, and enough to keep bee noses curious. By the third day, Brenda had her brunch plans set in motion. Tables, tents, little banners fluttering with her name. I overheard a few HOA neighbors talking about it at the hardware store. One of them, Steve, laughed and said she'd probably charge people to breathe near her jars. Another mentioned how he missed my stand already and asked if I'd start selling again soon. I gave him a wink and said, "Let's see how this weekend goes." That night, the weather was warm and calm. Perfect bee conditions. I stood out by the hives one last time before the big day. The air was alive with motion, the low hum of thousands of tiny wings floating through the lavender. I didn't need to say a word. The bees knew what they were doing. Nature always has a way of sorting things out when left alone. When morning came, the brunch began exactly as expected. Tables filled with HOA families, music playing softly, kids running around with juice boxes, and Brenda in full regalia. Her scarf was gone, her face makeup caked to hide the swelling. She had a little stage set up and everything, jars of her honey neatly lined up for samples. I stayed on my side of the fence, sitting under my porch with a cup of coffee, watching from a distance. I couldn't hear her speech, but I didn't need to. I already knew the words. Community pride, local trust. It was all an act. Then, right on cue, a few bees began to gather. Not many at first, just a couple scouts landing near the jars. Brenda noticed, waved them off with a napkin. Then more came. Dozens. The pheromones in the fake honey had worked better than I anticipated. The bees weren't attacking. They were investigating, crawling across the lids, swirling in circles. Someone screamed. A kid knocked over a plate. A whole basket of croissants went flying as people started backing away. Brenda lost it. She started flapping her arms wildly, knocking over her display. A jar broke. The scent got stronger. Bees filled the air now, drawn to the scent trail, to the sweetness they'd been trained to recognize. People ran. Brenda dove under the table with her handbag on her head, like a helmet. Someone turned on a hose and tried to spray the air, which only made it worse. I watched calmly, sipping my coffee. Not smug, not vengeful, just still, letting it all unfold like a slow-motion nature documentary. The balance of things restored by the very creatures she tried to exploit. No trap, no harm, just the truth with wings. Brenda's brunch ended with emergency calls, overturned tables, and the sound of bees humming louder than the stereo she'd rented for the event. By noon, the scene looked more like the aftermath of a country wedding gone wrong. People fled, carrying half-eaten scones and running shoes in their hands. One woman swatting her sun hat at the air like she was fencing an invisible enemy. But the funniest part wasn't the chaos. It was the fact that not a single person got seriously stung. The bees hadn't been aggressive. They were just curious, drawn by the pheromone trail Brenda had unknowingly set like breadcrumbs from my hives to her buffet table. Still, panic spreads faster than reality. And all it took was one guest swearing they'd felt something in their hair for the entire event to unravel. Brenda, of course, didn't take it well. She disappeared midway through the commotion and was later seen hosing herself down behind the clubhouse, soaked from head to toe, her white blouse stained and clinging to her like a paper napkin. The rain. The HOA board tried to do damage control, but several neighbors had caught everything on their phones, including Brenda shouting at a 7-year-old to stop breathing. The bees are targeting movement. That clip alone made it onto the community Facebook page before sundown, captioned with the words, "Queen Brenda versus the real queen bees." The fallout didn't stop at online humiliation. The next morning, a pest control van pulled into Brenda's driveway. Not long after, another vehicle arrived, animal control. Then a landscaping truck, and finally, a white sedan from the county. I watched it all from my porch, coffee in hand again, while she stormed up and down her driveway, arguing with each of them. She tried to insist there was a bee infestation spreading from my property. But I had all the permits, all the health inspections, and all the documentation that my apiary hadn't moved or expanded in years. It was Brenda's brunch, her honey jars, and her shady label scheme that had brought the bees straight to her. By afternoon, she marched over to my property line with a clipboard in one hand and her phone recording in the other. She shouted from a distance, accusing me of weaponizing insects, and claimed that I had deliberately redirected wild hives to sabotage a community function. I stayed on my porch, silent as ever. She walked back and forth just outside the boundary, trying to bait me. I didn't give her anything. My only response was to wave slowly and smile. That seemed to drive her even madder. What Brenda didn't know was that by now, the footage I'd clipped from earlier of her stealing my honey, of her standing in front of the camera smirking, of her trespassing, had already been shared with the HOA board. I dropped off copies quietly, without announcement, knowing that truth always hits hardest when it arrives unannounced. One of the newer board members, the same woman who exposed the bulldog in a bee costume lie, called me that evening. She thanked me for my patience and grace and said the footage had raised serious concerns. She didn't say much more than that, but I could hear in her voice that Brenda's grip on the board was weakening. Over the next few days, something shifted. Brenda was no longer strutting through the neighborhood like she owned it. Instead, she was seen pacing her yard on the phone, wearing gardening gloves and spraying random bushes with store-bought repellent. Neighbors who once nodded politely to her now crossed the street. A few even came to visit me for honey and left tips in the honor box, which I'd quietly reopened. One man said he used to be afraid of bees, but now he thought they were smarter than most people. I just smiled and offered him an extra jar on the house. But Brenda wasn't done. Not by a long shot. A week after the brunch incident, she filed an official complaint with the county, claiming that my bees were a public safety hazard. This time, I was ready. The inspector showed up mid-morning, a quiet man with a badge, a clipboard, and a pair of beat-up work boots. I led him out to the hives, explained the layout, showed him the fencing, the distance from all neighboring property lines, and the signage I'd posted per regulation. He nodded throughout, taking notes and occasionally watching the bees work. He asked if the bees had ever swarmed near human gathering areas. I explained the recent incident at the HOA brunch and gave him copies of the footage, including Brenda's theft and the scene at the clubhouse. He watched, expressionless, then handed me a signed inspection notice confirming full compliance. Before he left, he turned and said, "I've done this job for 12 years. These bees are better behaved than half the neighborhoods I inspect." I thanked him and walked him out with a jar of clover honey in hand. The next morning, Brenda's yard was swarming again, not with bees, but with contractors. She'd hired a private pest company to relocate any residual pollinator activity, which meant she was paying thousands to try and scrub away a trail of her own making. I couldn't stop myself from laughing when I saw the men standing awkwardly near the flower beds, with smoke cans and nets, trying to coax away bees that weren't even there anymore. My bees had already returned to their usual patterns, content, unbothered and busy with actual work. Word spread that Brenda's brunch business was suspended. Her fake honey brand disappeared from the clubhouse shelf. People whispered that she'd been fined for selling goods without proper labeling or a food permit. The HOA board announced a private meeting to review certain members' behavior and responsibilities. It was clear what that meant, and it wasn't just about bees anymore. Her authority was unraveling, and every thread of it had been pulled by her own hand. I spent the evening walking through the hives, checking on each one. The stingers were as active as ever, steady and focused. I leaned in close to one frame, listening to the low, vibrating hum that only comes from harmony and work. Bees don't care for drama. They care for order. They care for balance. And if you disrupt that balance long enough, they don't get mad. They act just like they did with Brenda. No trap, no poison, no confrontation. Just a trail of sweetness. She couldn't resist, and nature handling the rest. I sat on the porch again that night, under the same sky, sipping honey-sweet tea. Lights flickered across the HOA street, but Brenda's house stayed dark. No more guests, no more flyers, no more grand events. Just a silent house and an empty driveway. The bees, I figured, had done their part. The rest would come soon. The silence around Brenda's house didn't last long. Within days of the HOA meeting, the rumors turned into confirmations. Brenda had been removed from the HOA board in a closed-door vote. The official reason listed was a breach of ethical standards and misuse of community influence. But everyone knew it boiled down to the honey theft, the brunch disaster, and the now infamous bee swarm footage that had made its way onto local news. It wasn't the sting on her forehead that undid her. It was the sting of her own arrogance unraveling in public. Her face may have healed, but her pride was covered in bruises that would take far longer to fade. The news segment ran under the title "Backyard Beekeeper Defends Hive Against HOA Harassment." They'd reached out to me after someone on the board sent the video to a journalist. I hadn't asked for attention, but I wasn't going to hide from it either. When the reporter came out with a camera crew, I showed them the hives, talked about pollination, sustainability, and how important bees were to the land. I never mentioned Brenda by name. I didn't have to. Her actions spoke loudly enough, and the footage of her storming off my property with stolen jars in hand did the rest. That clip alone turned me into a minor celebrity. In our little county, orders for my honey tripled. A nearby farmer's market offered me a booth, rent-free. I turned it down, preferring my quiet roadside stand, but the attention still poured in. Even the local school invited me to speak to kids about beekeeping. When I walked in, one of the students raised his hand and asked if I'd ever trained bees to attack someone. I told him no. I just give them space, respect, and purpose. The rest is instinct. Back in the neighborhood, Brenda kept to herself. The once vibrant flower beds in her front yard were now a patch of upturned dirt and dead roots, victims of the expensive bee deterrent spray she'd used after the brunch. Her lawn, once the envy of the HOA, looked abandoned. No decorations, no garden flags, just a couple of wilted planters and a broken solar light hanging sideways. No one visited, not even the board members who used to cling to her words like gospel. One afternoon, I noticed her out front, kneeling by the sidewalk, digging up one of the remaining bushes. She wore long sleeves despite the heat, big sunglasses, and a wide-brimmed hat. It was clear she didn't want to be recognized. But as I walked by, taking the long way to my mailbox, she glanced up. Our eyes met for a moment, and in that moment, I saw it. Something not quite regret, not quite anger, something in between. A woman who had once ruled by intimidation, now reduced to silence by her own misstep. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. A few days later, a shiny new car pulled up to my gate. A man stepped out, dressed like a lawyer, but with the expression of someone who didn't want to be there. He handed me an envelope and explained that Brenda had filed a cease and desist order, alleging emotional distress, property damage, and defamation of character. I almost laughed, but I kept my composure. I told him I'd respond through the proper channels. Once he left, I walked straight to my office, opened my files, and printed out everything. Photos, videos, time-stamped logs, the full record. I didn't need a lawyer to know that her case would fold faster than a picnic chair under a bowling ball. I submitted my response the next day. Within a week, her claim was dismissed. The court even sent a warning letter, suggesting any future frivolous filings could result in fines. Brenda, for once, didn't retaliate. She simply vanished back into her house, blinds drawn and porch light off. She'd run out of allies, run out of leverage, and most of all, run out of excuses. I didn't celebrate. Not really. I just kept tending the hives. The bees didn't know anything about courtrooms or board meetings. They just kept moving forward, collecting, building, creating. It reminded me of the simplicity of doing something right over and over until the weight of truth becomes heavier than any lie someone can throw at you. And that's what happened. Brenda had built her little empire on fiction and ego, and it collapsed the moment something real stood against it. The funniest twist came not from the bees, but from a letter I received from the HOA. With Brenda gone, the board had reorganized. They wanted to extend an olive branch, so to speak. They offered to sponsor a community garden project and asked if I'd be willing to help teach the neighborhood about pollination and natural gardening. I considered declining. The old me would have. But then I thought of those kids at the school, the neighbors who'd quietly supported me, the ones who'd slipped extra bills into the honey box even when I told them it wasn't necessary. Maybe they weren't all like Brenda. Maybe some of them actually wanted to learn. I agreed, under one condition. I would set the schedule. I'd pick the location, and the bees would be included, not just tolerated. They agreed without hesitation. A month later, we held the first garden session. I brought one of the smaller observation hives, sealed and safe, with a window so the kids could see the queen and her workers moving through the frames. I talked about ecosystems, the balance of nature, and how bees aren't just producers. They're protectors. The parents nodded along. A few even took notes. No one asked about Brenda. No one mentioned the brunch. It was like a collective understanding had settled in that some things were better left as lessons and not arguments. Back at home, I stood by the edge of my land that evening and looked across toward Brenda's yard. The house was quiet again. The windows dim. A for sale sign had gone up earlier that week. Rumor was she was moving out of state, somewhere far away, somewhere with fewer bees. I couldn't say I was surprised. Pride is hard to swallow, especially when it's flavored with truth. I walked back toward the hives as the last of the sunlight faded. The bees were finishing their day, slipping one by one into the safety of the hive, their wings humming like a lullaby. I leaned against the fence and smiled. Not because I won, not because Brenda lost, but because nature had done what it always does when left to itself. It brought balance. Quiet, buzzing, undeniable balance. The for sale sign in Brenda's yard stood longer than anyone expected. Week after week, potential buyers came and went, some stopping just long enough to glance at the patch lawn, others getting out of their cars and taking a quick walk around, only to shake their heads and drive off. Whether it was the whispers that still floated around the neighborhood or the lingering damage to her once carefully curated front yard, something about that house had lost its shine. It no longer stood as a symbol of control or status. It was just a house now, heavy with silence and memories no one wanted to inherit. I kept my distance, not out of spite, but because there was nothing left to resolve. Brenda had lost more than a board seat and a brunch fiasco. She had lost the trust of the community, the illusion of superiority, and most importantly, the ability to manipulate situations without consequence. She never spoke to me again after her lawsuit failed. And I didn't expect her to. Some things just end quietly, the way an old machine powers down after sputtering out the last of its noise. One evening, about 2 weeks after the sign first went up, I saw a moving truck in her driveway. It wasn't a big operation, just a few boxes, some furniture, and a tall man who looked like a relative loading things into the back while Brenda stood off to the side with her arms crossed. She wasn't directing anything, just watching, distant and removed from the process. Like even she couldn't quite believe it was happening. I didn't wave. She didn't look my way. But as they closed the truck's doors and drove off, a strange calm settled over the street. It was like a long-held breath had finally been exhaled. With Brenda gone, things began to shift in the neighborhood. People smiled more. The HOA meetings became shorter, friendlier, even productive. The new president, a middle-aged man named Curtis, stopped by one morning with a jar of my honey in hand. He said he wanted to apologize for how things had gone in the past and officially invited me to join the HOA's Community Outreach Committee. I laughed and told him I preferred the company of bees to committees. He smiled and said he figured as much, then asked if I'd consider hosting a honey booth at the annual block party instead. That I agreed to. The block party came a month later, and for the first time in years, I walked through the neighborhood with my head high and no tension sitting on my shoulders. Kids ran around with balloon animals. Neighbors grilled burgers and handed out lemonade, and my honey booth sat under a shaded tree with a steady line of people asking questions about bees, flowers, and homemade recipes. I didn't talk about Brenda. No one brought her up. It was as if the neighborhood had quietly agreed to erase her reign from the record, replacing it with something lighter, something sweeter. Even the stingers seemed calmer these days. I'd rotated them back to their original hive location, farther from the road, and given them a fresh set of frames. Their productivity had been through the roof since early spring. I'd bottled enough honey to fill the pantry twice, and my roadside stand had never been busier. Word of mouth kept travelers stopping, and a few local stores had started asking if I'd consider wholesaling. I wasn't sure yet. I liked things small, manageable. The bees taught me that steady work was better than explosive growth. Nature didn't rush, and neither did I. Sometimes in the early morning, I'd sit by the hives and think about everything that had happened. Not just Brenda and her foolish theft, but how close I'd come to letting anger take the lead. It would have been easy to shout, to retaliate, to press charges and drag everything through courts and gossip chains. But the bees had shown me a better way. They didn't sting unless pushed. They protected their own, worked with purpose, and let their actions speak louder than any sound they could make. I'd followed their lead, and it had brought me peace. Real peace, the kind that doesn't depend on winning, but on knowing you stayed true to your principles. A few weeks after Brenda's move, I got a letter. No return address, just a simple envelope tucked into my mailbox with careful handwriting. Inside was a short note. It said, "You were right to stay quiet." I wasn't. "I'm sorry." That was it. No signature. But I knew who it was from. Maybe she didn't expect me to respond. I didn't. I just folded the letter, slid it into an old cigar box where I kept things that mattered, and left it there. Some apologies don't need replies. They just need to be heard. Life kept moving. Summer turned to fall. The lavender faded. The goldenrod bloomed, and the bees began to slow down, preparing for winter. I made my rounds, checked the hives, sealed up the cracks, and made sure they had enough stores to last the cold. There was something deeply satisfying in knowing they would survive the freeze, just as they had survived everything else. One quiet morning, as mist rolled across the pasture and the sun pushed its first light over the hills, I stood by the honey stand with a fresh row of jars lined up neatly in a row. The sign above it now read "Local Honey, Nature Protected." I sipped my coffee and watched as a car pulled up. A woman stepped out, someone I didn't recognize, but with the same curious look I'd seen 100 times before. She picked up a jar, read the label, and dropped a 10 into the box without saying a word. Then she smiled at me and said, "You must be the bee man." I nodded. "That's me." And that was enough. The bees buzzed gently in the distance, and the world felt right. Not perfect, not without its scars, but right. The land was quiet, the hives were healthy, and the lessons of the past had settled like pollen on the petals of something new. No more stings, no more speeches, just the hum of life moving forward, sweet and steady, exactly the way nature intended.